Hi, welcome, Namaste to the Yoga Out of the Box podcast. My name is Marvin and I'm a yoga teacher and practitioner. And on this podcast, I try to help people out of the yoga community nowadays to connect deeper to the topic of yoga. That means that we free yoga from all its cliches, all its boxes, make it more accessible for everyone, to integrate it as a modern kind of lifestyle, which is so much more than just the asana practice, and as well help young yoga teachers to educate themselves way more with real life conversations, stories, and insights from some of the biggest yoga teachers and practitioners of different kind of disciplines out of yoga, like breathwork, mindfulness, meditation, all the good stuff, you name it. You will find on this podcast each week a new super interesting conversation. As well, we have from time to time the pleasant of having a solo episode just with me. Today is one of these episodes when I can answer one of your questions. And today we had the topic of Ashtanga yoga. Like a few of you already know, I'm a big fan of Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga. That means I'm practicing Ashtanga yoga for the last 2 years now. And I want to go a bit deeper into the topic of Ashtanga yoga to make more stuff clear about it. Because I think as well, a lot of people which are new to yoga, as well as a lot of people who are maybe already in the topic of yoga, has a special kind of image of Ashtanga or have not even an idea. So if you're one of both, this episode is especially for you to clarify what is Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, what do we practice in Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, what are the benefits, what are maybe the cons in this practice, to name it like this. And let's just dive right into it. And let's start with my personal journey maybe. So like most of you know, I practicing yoga now for roughly 10 years. I started out in Miami on the beach with a first class of Vinyasa yoga, and then like most of us are visiting some classes and studios, doing it on and off, not really consistently. And while COVID hit, I went on to my own practice way more on YouTube, find a lot of cool Vinyasa classes from the US, from some amazing teachers I was already interviewing on this podcast. And learned more or less for myself. And before I got the first time to India and did my first yoga teacher training, I was really I love creativity in my flows. I love to be dynamic. I love to be a lot of active movement. And then I meet Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga. And in the beginning I was oh no, I won't like this because it's always the same. It's really sad. It's really fixed. And what happened is that I fall deeply in love with the practice. And like all of you may know now, I'm practicing really, really strongly for the last years. I dedicated a lot of my time, a lot of my life to this practice. And I found so much in this practice, even beside the asana. And my practice really changed from a lot of creative, a lot of dynamic stuff, more to really, let's say, progressive and based practice. And what I mean with this is that we have different layers we're working on in the Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga system. And I think this changed my whole perspective on the practice, and that's why I love to talk about it and why I love to practice it as well as teaching it. So that's basically what I'm doing now at the moment here in Brazil, in Florianopolis. I'm learning from a really, really good teacher, Kaka. And I'm looking forward to deepen my practice even more in the next month and years. And so it's a good topic for me to start out here. So what is Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga for people who have never heard of that? Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga is one path of the Hatha yoga tradition where all yoga we actually know about comes from. It refers back to the Yoga Sutras most of the time. When we're talking about yoga, all of them refers back to the Yoga Sutras, but especially the Ashtanga yoga system was found by Krishnamacharya and was evolved from Pattabhi Jois and his grandson Sharat Jois and made more popular. And they distilled the Yoga Sutras into a body practice. So they took a lot of asana, a lot of body practices beside all of this Ashtanga, which is like you guessed it, the name Ashtar already refers to the number 8 in Sanskrit, which means there are 8 paths or 8 limbs of yoga, which is, by the way, just to give you a hint, really related to the Buddhist tradition, where you have 8 limbs of evolving or enlightenment. So there's definitely a connection there. And they took these practices and put them together into a physical practice, the asana practice, which is just one path of the Ashtanga yoga. But what's really interesting is that we got like a mix. We got like this old ancient descriptions of like postures and different kind of descriptions of asanas. So in the Yoga Sutras, for example, there's just like a few times mentioned the word asana, and it always refers to seating positions, or like at least to positions which prepare your body for sitting longer for meditation. What we did then and we talk now about like 1890 to 1930 or 20, when Krishnamacharya was evolving the style, he, as a teacher who comes from an Ayurveda background and like a kind of, he was a wisdom person in India, to say this, was like that he condensed this and brought them together with other body practices, which were at this time really famous, from exemplary like the British colonizers and the more and more upcoming gymnasts from like the Scandinavia. So he took all of this and condensed it into a body practice. Back then, the asanas were just clarified into like their advanced, like how advanced they were, but they were not put into special sequences. He was believing that he has to put it together for an individual person. Then one of his students, Pattabhi Jois, took over and was practicing and teaching Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, how he was defining it, out of his own practice, out of his own research on his own practice and the research he did with other people while he was practicing. And so he put together 6 sequences which build up on each other, like according to the asanas, which are more difficult in the end than in the beginning, and he put them together in a special kind of way. So, for example, the first series of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga is also referred to the cleaning of the body, to mean that most people who start in the primary series have to clean their body first, because before they can work on their real practice. Then we have like Nadi Shodhana, the second sequence, which is more referring to like cleaning the energetic body and the energetic channels out of our system. And we go on. So what's interesting in this concept is that in the beginning, Ashtanga was also mentioned or like was taught as a kind of like research institute. That means the first Ashtanga Shala Pattabhi Jois was having in Mysore was referred to like he was researching. It was like making kind of experiments to explore this space between like physical, energetic, and thoughts. And he was doing this with people. And after a while, more and more people heard about him and came to India to train with him, to practice with him. And so he got more and more famous and made even the practice of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga more famous. And his style of teaching and his style of like practicing Ashtanga also changed over the, like we talk now from like 1965 to around about like 2008, 2009. And so we have like a big time gap in between how his practice changed and how he trained some of the most interesting teachers of our time. Now we are practicing with, and we maybe have as well on this podcast. So for example, one of my all-time favorite episodes and yours as well is the episode with John Scott on this podcast as well. For example, you have like a lot of super interesting different ways of approaching this style of yoga. For example, different teachers went into different directions out of these teachings. And I personally trained with some of these Ashtanga teachers, which trained directly with Pattabhi Jois, and each of them had like an individual perspective on the teachings and the system, how it works. So with this said, I think it's still that Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga is something which has like kind of tradition and kind of like specific heritage, which really separates Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga from a lot of modern yoga styles, because a lot of modern yoga styles are just like invented really newly. And obviously, like you see now, even Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga is not that old in this kind of practice. Ashtanga Vinyasa is just the sequence of the asanas. The Ashtanga system itself is way older, but if we talk about Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, this was most people talk about, by the way, when they mean they are practicing Ashtanga Yoga, is a relatively new practice, but in comparison, for example, to Vinyasa or Yin Yoga or Hatha Yoga, this is already like an old practice, which gives it like a kind of special charm, if you want so. And now, what is this? How does the practice itself look like? In Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, like I described earlier, we have like 6 sequences. Each sequence is building up on each other, and most people start with the primary series. So you have like a warm-up, then you have a lot of different standing postures, seating postures, you have your first big bends, and then you have a finishing sequence. And what people who don't like Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga say is, oh, it's not good to practice every day the same. And this is one really specific thing about Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, that you do the asana practice 6 times a week. You have 1 day off, and you have the moon days, like full moon, new moon, where you don't practice. So you have like a really, really intense practice, and you practice all the time the same, which makes the practice itself like really different than any other yoga practice you're usually doing in Vinyasa, Hatha, Yin Yoga. Most of the time you come to a class and it depends what the teacher is doing. He has a different practice this time than last time. Always like, for example, going to different like plank poses, or like going in different directions of what he wants to achieve with the practice. And so Ashtanga is always working on the same things. And you work towards the asanas until you reach them and until your teacher is referring them as to be good. If you reach a posture and your teacher is like convinced that you did it like correctly, you get the next one. And so it builds up. And so this means that a lot of people, on the other hand, will, because the sequence needs already a lot of dedication, always stay in maybe the first or the second sequence and will never like progress even further. And I see a lot of like pros and cons here. For example, to do every time the same has definitely the pros that you don't have to think too much. So that makes it easier for people to practice every day, to just start. Even so, you can do it by your own. You don't need a studio. You don't need even like a teacher specifically. You can just practice wherever you are, whenever you want. Third, you have the big benefit of like knowing what to do and like joining, for example, in a new studio, in a new shala, in a new community, with already knowing what you're going to expect. Because you know your practice, you know what to do. Fourth, you progress. This is one of my favorite points in Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. You have a really, really strong progress because you do the same thing every day, or like at least really regularly. You have the benefit that you can really, really progress in this practice. And I'm a good example for that because I was practicing a long time Vinyasa Yoga and I love it. And it gives you a challenge. And I have like a pretty dynamic, progressive Vinyasa approach, like my students know. But I really start to progress in my flexibility, in my strength, and in my mental health and even in my spirituality when I started with Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, because you're confronted with yourself all the time, again and again and again in the same situations. And this is actually like life works. You will always run through the same problems, the same challenges, the same obstacles in your life until you solve them. This is how the universe works. And even when you think you have already achieved one thing, you can be sure that the universe wants to prove you again and wants to like check in. Are you sure you got this? Are you sure you made this decision right? And this makes it so interesting for me and gave me at least really the feeling, okay, I have a path to go, which is like pretty clear. I can just follow. Plus, I can, even on this path, explore myself more. And I can progress on the path. So these are the pros. What are the cons in Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga? What I already said is that when you practice every day, you have a pretty high intensity. As well, the sequence itself is not that easy like people think when they hear primary series and they're fixed, so it has to be easy. No, most people will get stuck in the first and the second series. And that's because it's a big workout. It's like it needs a lot of strength, it needs a lot of flexibility, it needs a lot of endurance while you're practicing. Plus, it needs consistency. And all these 4 points are not pretty regular trained in our normal life. So it can be really hard and it can be even frustrating if you don't progress. I know people who are in one posture for years, and even people who, for example, already overcut a point and they will never go further than this point, and they already ended up with this. They know they will never progress from this point on. And this can be frustrating for people. Second thing, you maybe can injure yourself if you always do the same thing. And this was a really, really controversial topic we had here on the podcast with Adam Hassler in one of the previous episodes. So if you haven't listened to this, just check it out. And he was saying, if you always do the same from a like scientific background, it's not healthy for your body. And I agree with that in some points, because if you do it exactly the same, the risk of injuring yourself will increase because your body can't regenerate. And obviously, if you always do it in one specific way, your body just adapts to this way. And when then something else happens, you can injure yourself. What he misses out on saying, in my opinion, as an Ashtanga practitioner and maybe an advocate for this style of yoga, is that if you really go deep into the practice, you will really quickly notice that every day is different. Even if you do the same from the outside perspective, the inside perspective, what changes even on the body, on the physical layer, is completely different. You have different feelings of, oh wow, what happens when I put this more behind? If I put this forward? If I have this kind of engagement and enrichment? And you will see that even if you do objectively the same asana, you will evolve in your practice and in how you work with this asana. And so it gets much more strong. And this makes a big difference. And so you will even strengthen your body in specific postures, and you will learn in specific postures. So I think the risk of injuring yourself will much decrease by practicing every day the same, because you actually not just get your body more confident in what he is doing, but you explore your body way more. You know your body much more in this posture. You can work with that. And so this is another reason which is often referred that Ashtanga is not good. Third, people say Ashtanga is boring. I always do the same. But I think the same reason, like I mentioned before, as advocating Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga is here the case, because it's not boring at all, because you can progress. And you really feel, I progress in this asana, and I progress in my mental game, I progress in my physical game, I progress in my emotional game. And so when you put away all of these different options, all of these different opinions, all of these different ideas of, oh, I could practice today this and this and this, and I want to have every day something else. This is the incarnation of our ego. This is again what makes Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga for me so attractive, that it's the opposite of modern day society. A lot of people want nowadays have everything. Your ego is telling you, if you don't get anything, if you don't get everything, I will suffer. It's FOMO. What you have nowadays on social media, I want to have everything, and I want not to dedicate to one specific thing because I miss out on so many other options. But the truth is, if we really dedicate ourselves for one thing, we decide for freedom, because we eliminate all the other options. We know what to do. We just go in, we really do it, and not just think about it, like creating, again, images about, oh, what could have been. You dedicate to one thing and you enjoy doing it, and you really dedicate yourself. You get better in it, and you really, really learn, oh, wow, there's so much more in this one thing. And you get like a specialist, which is so much more freedom than having all the options and not knowing what to do. It's like cutting it down to one thing and really going for it. Okay, so we have the pros, we have the cons of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. We have the background of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. We have why I'm practicing Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga and why I'm teaching Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. What else to say? I think Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga is a really, really beneficial yoga style. It has its flaws. And obviously, like always, people can help themselves, and there are bad teachers out there, there are good teachers out there. I think what's important to recognize is that you have to try it for yourself and that you have to practice it for yourself. So go ahead, try it out, give me some feedback, and yeah. We have now a Patreon account, so if you want to support this podcast, please feel free to do so on the link in the description. As well, please follow the podcast along. Please leave a good review on the podcast player of your trust. And yeah, hope to hear you next week. Thanks and bye-bye. Namaste.